Conscient Podcast, episode 174. Artist, activist, researcher, and educator, Julie andreyev.
And so as an artist and educator, I see that this moment really calls for a way of working through decolonization and forging a path of care. How I like to think of this is through multispecies communities, so that we're as humans, we're surrounded by more than human life, even in our urban environments. And so this path of care for our multispecies communities that make up the neighborhood, the community, and ultimately the earth is where I see a kind of my call for research and practice.
I know Julie's work from my time on the board of directors of the Canadian Association for Sound Ecology, but also from the acoustic ecology community in Vancouver, where she is an associate professor in the Audain Faculty of Art at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, where she teaches new media, sound arts, and critical studies. Julie lives on the unceded traditional ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And she also lives on the unceded traditional territories of more than human animals and plant life, including bears, deers, raccoons, eagles, ravens, crows, hummingbirds, cedars, firs, salals, and others. And I have to say, it's the first time I see a land acknowledgement in this way that includes more than human life. And Julie's a good person to do this. Her multi-species art practice explores more than human creativity and our relations with everything. You'll hear her talk about some of her current projects, including Bird Park Survival Station, a long-term reciprocity project with local birds, and Branching Songs, a sound art project that draws attention to wondrous gifts provided by trees and forest ecosystems. During our conversation, Julie mentioned her book, which you'll find a hyperlink in the episode notes. The book is called Lessons from a Multi-Species Studio, Uncovering Ecological Understanding and Biophilia Through Creative Reciprocity. Near the end of the episode, you'll hear a fascinating story about crow friends of Julie's. So, enjoy. Hey Julie, welcome to Conscient.
Thank you, Claude.
I've known you through the Canadian Association for Sound Ecology, and I saw some of your work. I listened and experienced your work at in Seixalt at the Arts Council Gallery, and so I want to hear about that because I've been really intrigued by your relationship with more than humans, and so that'll be the focus. But also, you teach, and we've been brainstorming about some of the things that acoustic ecologists might be interested in the future. You know, what are some of the young people doing? So that there's obviously a sound aspect, but there's also a sort of larger than human or other than human aspect that really interests me. But let's start with like a quick intro of who you are and what your background is.
Thanks, Claude, and yeah, thanks for inviting me to be on your podcast. I'm really thrilled. Well, just to give you a tiny kind of history, I grew up here. We're currently sitting in your living room on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, and my parents have a really interesting history. Their parents migrated actually from Russia and Estonia and Poland, and they ended up in China This was during the Russian Revolution and around that period. And my mother and father actually grew up in Shanghai. And so they have this history of migration, and my parents actually ended up getting together in Shanghai, and then they left during the Second World War and traveled to Canada, but stopping over in Australia before they were able to land in Canada. So I feel like a enormous amount of gratitude here in being able to be in Vancouver, and it's such a beautiful place. And I really have a lot of gratitude for my parents who, brought me up to have a real kind of attention to more than human worlds, and AKA nature, and just paying attention to the world around one, and what that means for oneself and one's kind of place in the world. Just currently, I'm working with what I call a multispecies studio practice. I'm an artist. I also teach at Emily Carr University. I'm an associate professor there, and mostly what I teach is in new media and sound arts and critical studies. And I have a couple of ongoing projects on the go. One of the ones that you saw at the Sunshine Coast Arts Council, that was branching songs. The other project I have is the Bird Park Survival Station. So those are kind of my interests at the moment. I think what's really informing the artwork and the research that I'm doing now is these challenges, and you brought them up in your introduction. Really, I see them as a kind of interconnected anthropogenic challenges of climate change and wild habitat loss due to what I call colonial resource extraction, involving deforestation, development, and agriculture. And so as an artist and educator, I see that this moment really calls for a way of working through decolonization and forging a path of care. How I like to think of this is through multi-species communities, so that we're as humans, we're surrounded by more than human life, even in our urban environments. And so this path of care for our multi-species communities that make up the neighborhood, the community, and ultimately the earth is where I see a kind of my call for research and practice as an artist and educator.
And what does it look and sound like?
Well, the project that you saw, the Sunshine Coast Arts Council, that was a project called Branching Songs. And this is a project I've been working on for a long time, for a few years, with a team of artists and student researchers. It's really a kind of a multi-species art project relating with trees and forests around Vancouver and the coastal regions, such as Sunshine Coast. And the goals of it are to foster understanding and care for forests and trees who are supporting the well-being of humans and more than human life. So in these projects, there's all kinds of experiments that we've done that have sort of taught us how to listen to trees. But the projects overall, they blend listening and acoustic ecology approaches with electroacoustic performance techniques and methods. We have, we work with video as well and workshopping. And a really crucial component of this is building land-based material processes and approaches. And this is, with the Branching Songs work, it was informed by an artist we were working with, Lara Felsing, who was a Métis artist, where we were working with her to adapt approaches of land-based and harvesting materials to work within this kind of these performative events. So that's kind of like the concept and the methods around it. But what you saw in the gallery was two things. One was a recording of a performance we did in Tsleil-Waututh Springs Forest, which is a beautiful intact forest above Seixalt. And this is a forest that has a year-long spring that is of fresh water that that animals use to, to everybody needs water. It's part of the watershed, and it also has really old trees. There's some cedar trees, western red cedar, and then there's a lot of Douglas fir trees, all kinds of trees that are intact. They have not been logged, at least for a few hundred years. So what we were doing was working with local communities. There's the council, the Arts Council, but also there's a conservation group called Elphinstone Logging Focus, and they have been tracking the deforestation through BC Timber of these intact forests that's occurring all over the Sunshine Coast, and a lot of it is sort of hidden away. So a lot, the community doesn't necessarily see what's happening. But we wanted to draw attention to this beautiful forest because we worked with a guide and knowledge keeper, Robert Joe, who is part of the Seixalt Nation, and he told the story of this forest as being one of the forests that the Seixalt people would use historically as a hunting and gathering location. Also, the forest provides a huge amount of support for the local ecosystems, like birds. While we were there, there was a gorgeous hairy woodpecker family foraging and making a nest in one of the snags. We created this, through the research that we were doing, we finally kind of created this performance that was in the forest, that was documented and put in the gallery. And what's interesting about at least I think it is interesting about the performance is that it had what I kind of consider to be sort of an extension of a listening practice that involves thinking about more than human communication, interspecies communication between us as performers, the audience, and the more than human beings around us in the forest. So, for instance, we were we were using a method of listening to the ambient soundscape and then responding to that soundscape live through the instruments that we had developed. Some of the instruments involve contact mics that we wrapped with these beautiful handmade ribbons that Lara built around the large trees, and then we built some land-based materials called tree feelers, and would gently touch the trees in certain ways to create sounds that were picked up through the contact mics that were then fed through some software, and then broadcast those through a system that Giorgio Magnanensi built. He was one of the collaborators on the project, using these. They're I can't remember. You're gonna have to edit this out. They're called resonators, and they're basically like made of reclaimed wood that has a transducer on them, and it activates the wood as like a speaker. So it's outputting the sound that we're creating through these kind of electroacoustic techniques. One of the instruments that we built is a tree voice instrument, and that has sensors that takes electromagnetic field information from trees, from their leaves. The sensors are actually on the leaves, and then converts that to information that we can use to create sound. So that instrument is kind of creating this tree voice for the performers to build then their compositions on. The other project in the gallery was Clear Cut Chorus, and that was a an installation, a multimedia installation based on a clear cut that is the Sandy Hook clear cut below Seixalt, and that's a clear cut that I think it was cut in 2021. And the tragic aspect of that one is that it after they clear cut that lot, they discovered that there was a seashell burial ground at the foot of the clear cut. So there was a stop work order, and all the slash piles were left intact. And the slash piles, if you've ever seen, they're huge. Basically, what they are is piles of the wood remains of the trees that weren't taken by the timber company. So whatever is left over that's of no commercial value is piled into these enormous slash piles. They're like 30 feet in diameter, and there were literally like hundreds of them in this lot. So it is like an extension of this graveyard, and in this case with these remnants of trees. So we worked with a local photographer, Simon Levin, and he photographed the ends of these trees that were in these slash piles. So you can imagine, like they're called, they're you've seen them as tree cookies. They're where you see all of the rings of the growth rings of the trees, and then we used those photographs to kind of sonify the lives of those trees based on an analysis program where we could look at some information from those trees, like what years had drought, what are the spaces, in other words, reflecting the spaces between the rings. So what you saw in the gallery was on the screen was these portraits of these cut trees appearing as projection. And then some resonators that Giorgio built as the speakers that would output this live interpretation of the sound of these trees, these portraits of the trees, their voices, I guess, as a chorus within the gallery.
I guess one of the things that intrigues me is, how do we know if other than more than humans want to actually communicate with us? Like, what language, is there a common language? And of course one can talk about the relationship, but to actually have a relationship with birds and trees, I believe it's possible, and there are senses that we underuse, but how do you communicate with the more than humans yourself?
I mean, with that project, with the recital, the performance in the forest was called Recital with a Forest, and with that one, I would say it was more direct as far as sound making. So sound making in response to the sounds that we heard. Let's say at one point in the performance, one of the family of this hairy woodpecker started flying from tree to tree and foraging. So when they forage, they make the knocking sound that is distinct to their species, and that foraging sound is something we can respond to, right? As sound makers. So as artists within there, we would respond we kind of thought about it as a call and response. So using our instruments to try to knock in the same way, or to maybe create a drone to accompany the knocking. We also thought about, well, what does it mean to communicate about or with the abiotic entities around that area? So, for instance, the stream, this spring, that's year-long spring. So we have approaches where we can evoke the sound of water, or we're very close to the ocean, because we're on the coast, and so thinking about what are the sounds the waves are making, and what does that communicate. So it's when talking about interspecies communication, it's sort of in these really broad terms. But I think a lot of that has to do with, really spending time to listen, first of all, and to see first of all, who is communicating, and potentially to understand what are they communicating, and how can I respond. And that's enters into a territory of reciprocity that, I'm really interested in these days.
Yes, you've used the term a number of times. We know what reciprocity means, generally speaking, of giving back and sort of some kind of equal sharing. But what does it mean in sound?
Yeah, what does it mean in sound? Well, just like I have a term I like to use, and I'm just going to plug my book.
Sure.
Which is,
I'll put it in the episode notes.
Okay. It's my book is called Lessons from a Multispecies Studio, and the subtitle is Uncovering Ecological Understanding and Biophilia Through Creative Reciprocity. And so I've been trying to unpack this idea of creative reciprocity. What does it mean? Because there's in a lot of indigenous methods and ceremony, there is and stories, there is this call of reciprocity as a way of being in the world. And in terms of art making, how I see this is thinking about how can creativity offer a way into reciprocating with gifts, as a way to kind of give back to the gifts that the earth provides. So just to give a context, so spending some time and taking notice of all the wonderful things that the earth provides: the air, the water, the food, material for shelter, comfort. And within our culture, there's this drive of resource extraction and consumption that really distances from ourselves from relations with the earth. And so I think taking a step back and really recognizing these gifts that the earth provides, and then thinking about forms of reciprocity that can recognize the gift and give back to the earth in return. So what I mean by that is potentially like physical, meaningful contributions to more than human life, and that could be advocating. It could be, habitat conservation.
Or becoming a vegan or something.
Going vegan, not flying. It could be, there's all kinds of things that one can do, right? But in terms of an art process, there could also be recognizing how creative more than life is. So reciprocating could be in the form of material, reusing material, repurposing, or thinking about the content of the work that might advocate for or draws attention to more than human beings, or the amazing properties of the earth, or maybe the challenges we face with climate change and habitat loss. So I think the Branching Songs project was really a kind of a research into how sound can function that way, and our physical presence, obviously, in these locations, and then bringing those to a creative environment like the gallery.
Well, it seems to me that our absence would also be beneficial to more than humans, right? Just leaving them alone, or approaching them in new ways, and being aware of the planes and trains and cars and their effect on. And of course, it's hard to do in this crazy modern world where we are accelerating, and the idea of slowing down, listening, but also feeling, right? Feeling like we noticed at our cottage the disappearance, not total disappearance, but the decrease of frog life. And this was back 30 years ago when there was acid rain, right? And acid rain all across eastern North America, maybe here as well, was affecting everything. And then they slowed that down a little bit. Life came back a little bit, but you could hear, you could feel the pain and the suffering of wildlife of all kinds. So to me, the reciprocity is paying attention to their needs and their genuine needs, not in relationship to our needs, but their own needs. And to me, a part of it is backing off. And how do you do that in an urban space? How do you do that when you want to have a relationship with them? And that's why my question was, how do we know if they want to have a relationship with us, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know, but we can explore and we can listen and we can make mistakes and we can move back and forward. But that's why I thought your installation at the gallery was interesting, because it was an invitation to experience things that we might not otherwise have. And there was part of it that was in the forest. I remember there were signs, kind of a listening exercise in the forest, which is very simple, right? There's just a few panels and in poetic type language that, and I love that because it allows me to be more present in the space and to think about my footprint, literally my footprint, like where am I stepping on? What sound does it make? What is it crushing? And that's the kind of sensitivity I think we need, is context about everything. And you know, Hildy, a mutual friend, Hildegard Westkamp, keeps talking about slowing down, and so does so do a number of people. But how do you slow down, listen, and still engage meaningfully with what is around us? I mean, it's an open-ended question because I don't have there's no magical solution, but certainly paying attention, slowing down is going to help.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Claude, with what you're saying and framing it. Thank you. First of all, I think I agree with you that it doesn't necessarily, building relations doesn't necessarily include intervention, right? Leaving alone, respecting, and allowing for those ecosystems to exist without necessarily having human intervention. But we also have to face reality. One of them is historical, which is that humans have always been a part of what we consider to be wilderness, right? With indigenous people working in beautiful relation with the land. And when we think about, I just want to backtrack a little bit with your comment about a light footprint. I think the work in the gallery, the Branching Songs work, really did invite people to think about even that, walking into a forest. We don't have to consider the forest just as, trees that service industry and lumber, right? These are vital ecosystems, and more than human people are going about their business, whether we're there or not. But to think about, each step we take within those ecosystems has an effect. Like this Tsleil-Waututh Springs forest had, when we visited in the spring before the show, there was this huge layer of moss. The whole forest was covered in moss that was, inches deep. And, moss takes a long time to grow. It's like, some moss is like one little branch per year. So you can imagine these tiny forests, that are just covering the forest floor, how old they must be. But then when we returned in June and July, the mosses had already, shrunk up. They change over the summer, and one's footprint is noticeable, right? When disturbing these little ecosystems. So thinking about that obviously is important, and inviting the audience to consider that kind of care. But another thing I just want to talk about is this idea that we live in here we are, we're sitting in your living room, we're in the city, right, in Vancouver. But the city is filled with more than human life. It's not just for humans, right? And I can hear the the birds outside my place in the morning, and so how do we think about the more than the multi-species habitat that is a city, and even bringing those listening practices and engagement practices with the birds around one's home or other wildlife, I think is really crucial. Because here's the thing with when we think about the city, and the more than human inhabitants that are part of it, we see them in this city because their kin from previous generations faced a shrinking wild habitat, and they had to learn to cohabitate with human populations. So now, with climate change, birds and everyone are faced with further existential challenges. So really, the wildlife that are living in cities are not only living here, but they're also communicating about us and with us all the time. So I see this as a real challenge, but also an opportunity to spend time to listen and pay attention to what they're communicating, and maybe building relations that way. So I've started this, thinking about that as like this, thinking about the city as this multi-species space. I have a project called the Bird Park Survival Station, and that's a project I've started in 2015, and it's ongoing. And it's a project with the local birds, and it includes the crow family, whose territory includes my home. So the park, I built it on the roof of my home because I have this flat roof. I'm on the east side of Vancouver, and I provide affordances to the local and migratory birds. So it could be fresh water every day, small amounts of food, caching and perching features such as bushes and trees to really help them survive the climate emergency. And in some, during some periods, I install a unobtrusive camera and sound recording system and record the birds' activities as they use the park. And so then I've recorded like hundreds of hours of this data, and my poor research assistants, sometimes they just have to sift through this data. But we can analyze the videos for information about the birds and how they use the affordances in the park, and then improve them and develop them for the park. So I see this as kind of my way to reciprocate to the birds who are living in this area. Sometimes the material in the videos is interesting, and so I put them together into a video, and we've shown videos and artworks of sound recording. I have a sound album called the Bird Park Sessions, and so those are kind of the art outcomes. But as the art evolves and as the analysis kind of improves, and I develop relationships with the individual birds around the park, it becomes this continually evolving project based on what they need and what I'd like to also include in my practice.
Well, I'm excited about that because in the last few episodes we've been talking about local, and how our future will inevitably be more local because globalization is not going to be possible, at least not the way it is now. And so the relationships between humans, but also with more than humans, are going to be increasingly important for survival and for quality of life. Like, who do we interact with? Who do we count on? Each other, right? Because they don't need us as much as we need them, I think, in the more than human world. But it's a new area for me. Even the language is new to speak of more than humans. Like, I wasn't educated. I studied music, and the dominance of the human was assumed, right? And it's changing, and it's changing for me, and it's changing for people who are listening and allowing themselves to experience things that they've experienced before in new ways. Like, you go to the cottage, but when you're really open and respectful, you really pay attention to all the living beings and how they're all interacting. And this isn't just touchy-feely. This is like living your life fully. It's like your life is very much conditioned by your relationship to others and context, right? So anyway, that's why I was excited, because we're both sound artists and we're both working in the sort of general field of listening. How can listening help us connect to call it other worlds, but the worlds that exist here that we're not paying enough attention to. So that's my question to you. How can listening help in all of these things?
Well, I mean, I've talked about the branching songs. I think, like, I'm just going to talk through the projects because this is my area of where I guess spent quite a few years thinking about that, and like there's a physical presence being, a method of being physically in relation to, let's just say, birds for now. But we can talk about that as a sort of a kernel of all more than human life. But to be in the presence of and to develop a relationship in physical proximity is one way, as you were describing through being at the cottage and listening. There's also getting to know, like those birds around me, around the bird park, they're the same individuals who've lived there for years and years. So I get to know them and get to know their habits and their what they need to do on a daily basis, and their yearly traditions, their seasonal traditions,
their offspring, their whatever.
Totally. And like there's the crow couple who live in the area, and they've over the years have got to know me. Crows can identify individual humans. I'm not as good as identifying individual crows, but they're much better at the other end of the stick. But they, we've developed a relationship where they give gifts. They reciprocate to me for some of the things in the bird park. Like, for instance, every year when they're nesting, once the temperature starts to get, and we get less rain here, I start putting water out every day, and they always leave to start like a little twig in the water dish. As they're nesting, they're building their nests, and they have very particular twigs that they create, that they find and they modify for their nest. So they include one in the water dish as a kind of a little thank you, and then over the season, they leave different gifts that kind of identify what they're doing. So, for instance, the female will give a little, leave for me a little regurgitated piece of food that's like a little pellet that she creates for her babies, right, when they hatch. And that job is like something that they're constantly working on all day, is feeding these babies. So, but she'll leave me one just to let me know that hey, the babies have hatched, we need more food. And then sometimes if they're, we give them a special little treat, like special nuts or whatever, we get a little gift in return. So, for instance, like I have, like some gross stuff, like a what do you call this? A ear plug. Mm-hmm. An ear plug. They left a nail. They like a bottle cap. Some beach glass. A bong. Some really interesting stuff. Anyway, that I think is quite funny, but it also is a form of communication, right? Through objects, that the crows are communicating with me, and I get real delight from that. There's also there's a neighbor couple of sparrows, house sparrows, that have been there for years. They're like at least 5 or 6 years have this nest that's in between the two buildings, our building and the one next door. And they've been, generating new generations every couple of months. We know them. The male, we call him Little Man, and he's like always out there, defending his territory. So I love this because, as you say, I mean, I agree with you that it's kind of like being fully present in the moment for me, and also thinking about all of this activity and this vitality around me in more than human life just keeps me sane anyway. In the day the days that we're living in right now, which are filled with really, I think, anxiety about climate and everything else we're facing.
Well, I'm sure listeners have their own stories of relationships with more than humans, and I'd love to hear those stories. I know there's many podcasts that are about that, but for me, it's used because recording technology allows us to have some kind of a record, even though it's not a perfect record. There's a whole ethic. We won't get into this now, but the whole ethics of recording. There's so many ways that we can question our assumptions of what is right, what belongs to us, and what reciprocity really means. Like it's it's a very humbling thing to be truly reciprocal and to receive and to give, and it's also very joyful. We're going to end soon because I'm going to the beach in a minute. It's
And
Friday,
so you should.
Friday afternoon here in Vancouver. I'm going back home tomorrow to Ottawa. But I like ending the episode on any reading material or things that you're in contact now that you'd like to recommend to our listeners.
Yeah, I'd love to give a little shout out to a couple of podcasts, actually. One is local, and it's produced by a colleague of mine, Daphne Plesner, and it's a series on her tree museum website, and it's called Talking Territory. And it's interviews that explore aesthetics and the politics of trees and animals in relations to the land. She has a couple of podcasts with Coast Salish knowledge keepers, and also about her relations with the deers who live in the territory around her home. She lives on Pender Island, so it's very local and beautiful, kind of connecting decolonial thought with this really deep consideration of relations with the land. And then also, I don't know whether you know about this podcast series. It comes out of Yale Law School, and it's called When We Talk About Animals. And there's one of the episodes is really wonderful with Bernie Krause. A couple of books, actually. Yeah, I'd love to mention. One is kind of an old book, but I rediscovered it recently, Pauline Oliveras' Quantum Listening. And it's a tiny book, but it's really kind of helps situate this whole practice of listening and activism, and just what does it mean to listen or to hear, the differences between that. And then also Richard Wagamai's One Drum. And Richard Wagamais was a Ojibwe scholar who wrote a book called The One Drum, and it's the 7 grandfather teachings, and how these translate to contemporary life. So he's kind of adapted them to reflect how we can be more, I guess, solidly in relation to the land in a respectful way. And what I have on my desk that I haven't started reading yet, but that's on my list, is Zoe Schlanger's The Light Eaters, which is about plant life and how amazing they are. So yeah, that's
a good list. You made me, as you spoke about Richard, I pronounce it Wagamese, but I think it could be pretty pronounced in different ways. His last unfinished novel was called Starlight, and there's so many beautiful descriptions of sound, and I just remember the joy of reading about sonic experiences, because you somehow imagine them in your mind, or you might try to recreate them when you're in the forest or something. But I appreciate the cues for listeners, podcasts that maybe are not so well known, and I hadn't heard of them, right? And so I'll give them a listen, and they might or might not resonate with me now, but the fact that I know that they exist and there's people out there exploring some things makes me feel good.
Nice. Well, maybe sometime they'll be listened to.
Thank you, Julie, so much. You've been a wonderful
Claude.
guest, and we've talked about things that we will talk about again.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.